not Al Kaszniak. So I'm Dick Bootson, and I have the honor to introduce him. And so Al got all of his degrees, bachelor's, master's, PhD, from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And not only that, he stayed in Chicago for 3 years after that at Rush Medical Center and was an assistant professor. And then he just decided winters in Chicago were enough, and he came to Arizona. And he was hired in the College of Medicine. And so he was in psychiatry. I guess that would be around 1879, is that right? And but in 1985, he expanded and moved over to the psychology department. Lee Sechrist was head of the department at the time and saw the talent that was being hosted over at the medical school and brought him over.
They were desperate here.
We didn't have any faculty in 1985. Some of us came a couple years later. So Al has had a wonderful career, and he's sort of on every possible committee and every possible department that one can imagine. And I thought among his awards, there is a particularly appropriate one.
Oh
no.
And so he got the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval.
It's my favorite. The only other one I've lusted after is there used to be this Pacific Gas Award for faculty, and I thought you could be an official old fart with it.
So this is a real award, and he was listed as one of the 327 best mental health experts in the United States in 1994. Right. So I'm not going to take up Al's time because all of you already know who he is, but he's going to talk about an interesting aspect of his research interests, which are empathy and compassion, contemplative and neuroscience perspectives. So we're eager to hear how one brings science to those topics.
Thank you, Dick. I appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. So for those of you who have become accustomed to hearing me talk endlessly about Alzheimer's disease, which I've been working on, today I get to share with you my philosophos and talk about something that has become increasingly of interest to me over the last few years. Fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to go through some things relatively quickly, but I will try to save enough time that we can have some good discussion. So first of all, what are we talking about? What is empathy? My friend and colleague, cognitive philosopher Evan Thompson, reminds us that it has to do actually with several overlapping things. One, feeling what another person is feeling, knowing what another person is feeling, and then responding compassionately to another person's distress. And sometimes we parse this out separately as different from empathy. But how do we understand compassionate response to suffering? How do we factor it into our notions about where this plays a role in human nature? And it's here where contemplative traditions and science have had rather different perspectives, at least in the past. So the contemplative tradition represented by Buddhism and the Dalai Lama being, in some sense, a popular spokesperson for that tradition, says that it is important in support for his thesis that human beings are fundamentally compassionate, that we seem to have a natural ability to connect spontaneously and deeply with the suffering of others. It indicates a profound interconnectedness among all living beings. So a sense that this is really a fundamental aspect of human nature, and also one that does not require some unusual kind of development, but rather stripping away things that get in the way of its expression. That might be contrasted with what Anne Harrington, historian of science at Harvard, had to say in describing the approach, at least of Western science, to empathy and compassion. These natural sciences are not really convinced that human beings are naturally compassionate. On the contrary, tend to tell us that altruism and self-sacrifice are fragile, even slightly puzzling human qualities. So it's been rather recently that developments within social neuroscience, I think, have begun to close some of this gap between these two perspectives, and it's that I want to focus on for the next little bit of time in this talk. One very relevant body of work comes from this domain of affective sharing, or you might call it affective resonance or mimicry. An influential paper by Preston and DeWall, published in 2002 in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, went through some of the examples in empirical research arguing for humans and other primates automatically mimicking and synchronizing emotional expression with others. So the obvious example of mothers and infants, but also in primates. Here you see the experimenter sticking out his tongue and being mimicked by the infant monkey. The argument they make from a variety of perspectives is that this is really automatic, that this is not something that's an effortful accomplishment. So what are some of the kinds of data that support that kind of perspective? There are a number of studies in this area, but I'll use one by Ulf Dimberg and colleagues, where they utilize very brief exposures of happy and neutral and angry faces. So examples of the angry and the neutral faces shown here. Let me see if I can focus on that. That were immediately followed and masked by neutral faces. Sufficiently well masked that individuals were not able to correctly describe what kind of emotional or whether there was emotional expression on their face at all. What they found, shown here, is increased zygomatic electromyographic activity, kind of smile muscle, to the happy faces, and increased corrugator EMG to angry faces, and interpreted this as evidence that having relatively little conscious access to what was being shown, nonetheless individuals were mimicking the kind of facial expressions that were within the slides. So what seems to underlie that sort of mimicry, if indeed it's automatic? It's here where the mirror neuron story, probably familiar to most of you by now, begins to play an important part. Rizzolatti and colleagues back in the 90s, studying motor systems in monkeys, stumbled across the observation that when observing someone engaging in an action, that there were bursts of neural activity within the same systems that were responsible for the execution of that action when the monkey itself was doing it. So these electrophysiologic recordings showing what they termed mirror neurons, particularly in the ventral premotor and posterior parietal areas, that fired both during goal-directed actions and observing the same actions being performed by someone else. So what does this have to do with empathy? Well, first off, do we see that in humans as well? So work of Iacoboni and colleagues, as well as numerous others now, demonstrating with fMRI that the same kind of activity is demonstrable in humans when